I am very happy to welcome Dr. Karin Meyers to the Archives of the Impossible conference. Dr. Meyers received her PhD from University of Chicago Divinity School. She has been a professor of Buddhist Studies at various colleges and universities, including Kathmandu University in Nepal, where she directed a master's program through Rangjung Yeshe's Institute's Center for Buddhist Studies. She is now the academic director at the Mangalam Research Center in Berkeley, California. Dr. Meyers' research and writing focuses on Buddhist and cross-cultural philosophy and how it relates to metaphysical, epistemological, ethical, and ecological questions. Her research is informed by experience in meditation cultures in both Tibetan and Theravada traditions, including work as a retreat support fellow of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. She is now editing a volume of essays based on a 2022 NEH Summer Institute about Buddhism and the imagination. I am so thankful to have myself benefited from Dr. Meyers' wonderful scholarship on Buddhist traditions, and I am looking forward to hearing what she has to say about Buddhism and the impossible today. Please help me welcome Dr. Karin Meyers.
Hello, everyone in the room and out there. I'd like to start by thanking Jeff Kripal and everyone else who has worked to put together this symposium. I'd also like to thank all of those who've worked so hard to put together the archives of the impossible, who've worked to make those possible. I feel honored and also very humbled to be here speaking amongst such accomplished scholars and researchers. In thinking about how I could contribute to the mission of this institute symposium, I thought it might be useful to reflect on how paranormal phenomena, which are all over the place in Buddhist traditions, are normally quarantined in Buddhist studies. That is, how they are not exactly denied, but are treated in ways that keep them from challenging our default assumptions about what is real or possible and how we know what we know. I'd also like to imagine with you what it would look like if this were not the case, if paranormal phenomena, experiences, or events were not only thematized in Buddhist studies, but made central topics of inquiry in comparative Buddhist philosophy, my own subfield. So that's the general plan, and it's, oh, my bold disappeared. Well, it was in bold on those two bottom points. And as my paper developed, I added a 6-bullet point, and maybe you can't see it, but it's there, and it says that I will also present a comparative framework to help us think through the contextual specificity and ontological plurality of these phenomena we call paranormal. But first, as the slide indicates, I'd like to start by defining some terms, and then I'll say a few words about why we ought to be skeptical of materialist or naturalist claims about what is possible and why we need the humanities to study the impossible or paranormal. And after making this slide, I realized that last sentence, it has, there's two, the second to last sentence has 2 ways to read it. You can read it as, and I mean both meanings, so I just left it in there, right? It's the impossible cannot be studied without the humanities, and we really ought to study the impossible in the humanities. So I start with just some definitions because my training is in philosophy. So by paranormal, I mean phenomena that cannot be explained according to current scientific theory, phenomena that appear to challenge our default assumptions, ontological assumptions, and frameworks of materialism and naturalism. That is, our ideas, theories about reality, what exists, or what is possible. And by impossible, I take it to have the same referent as paranormal, but a different connotation. It's what we're supposed to believe about the paranormal. Another word for this is damned. It's the term the early 20th century collector of anomalies, Charles Fort, used to describe impossible facts, facts that are excluded from official knowledge and discourse because they don't make sense in its terms. I've really liked that term ever since I was introduced to it by Jeff's book, Authors of the Impossible. I think it captures really well the psychosocial dynamic in the academy when it comes to the paranormal. That is, all the ways we avoid talking about the paranormal or even thinking too much about it, even when it is at the center of our subject matter, as in so much Buddhist studies. Another word I will use for this in my talk is the damned topics. In the academy today, the view seems to be most responsible for this damning is, of course, materialism. We've already talked about it a little bit, but I'll just say it's the idea that matter exists or that matter is primary, and all phenomena, including mind or consciousness, are reducible to, supervene upon, or emerge from material causes. You can ask me about what that means after those three qualifiers. But naturalism is a bit trickier. It's a bit trickier because the category of the natural is contested. What counts as natural in Thai Buddhism or in an Ojibwe context will be different from what counts as natural in the modern academy. However, I think natural might be the more relevant category when it comes to the damned topics. Many people who are not necessarily committed to materialism operate with a cultural understanding of what is natural that is ill-defined, but yet parasitic on materialism. And so this is often called scientific naturalism, which we can define as the view that nature or the natural cannot violate or operate outside of the context of physical laws. Usually meaning that it must depend on material causes or some kind of material substrate. So although the natural is ill-defined, it functions perfectly well to exclude the supernatural, right? Those rogue phenomena that don't appear to have any material cause or that seem to violate or ignore physical laws. But as we well know, that such things can exist, even if they do, and they're impossible, even if they sometimes happen. So while supernatural and paranormal commonly refer to the same phenomena, paranormal does not make assumptions about what is natural. It is beyond normal and inexplicable according to current scientific theory, but is not necessarily unnatural. Indeed, as this symposium and the archives demonstrate, the paranormal is all over the place in human experience, and even or especially in our intimate interactions with elements of the so-called natural world. So despite this, paranormal phenomena are damned because they tend to blur or even collapse our boundaries between mind and matter, subject and object, or inner and outer, which undergird ideas about the real and how we know it. In other words, the paranormal not only offends our default ontology, but also our epistemology. It offends the idea that the object or what is known is independent from the subject or the knower. It offends the idea of objective knowledge, the idea that the world is given, that is out there to be discovered and made of discrete or isolatable objects whose common properties are available to any independent observer. It offends the idea that this world can only be affected by our physical actions, but not by our thoughts or a state of consciousness or our ritual incantations or our communings with non-physical or only quasi-physical beings. So I'll offer some alternatives to this dualistic epistemology later, but for now, I just want to very quickly, if I can, summarize why we ought to be skeptical of materialist and naturalist claims about what is possible. First of all, science hasn't proved that the paranormal can't happen. To the contrary, there's credible evidence that it does, even if we don't know what sense to make of it. So you've heard about some of this in the conference. Directly relevant to Buddhist studies is some parapsychological research into phenomena such as children who remember previous lives, various kinds of psychic powers or psi, and out-of-body or near-death experiences. there's a common assumption that science has failed to find evidence for these phenomena or that has failed to replicate these findings. That's not true. And I've listed some overviews here, but I'm going to skip describing them for the sake of time. But these are very useful places to start if this literature is new to you. Okay, so to my next point. The success of the modern scientific method in understanding, predicting, or controlling various aspects of our physical world is often taken to support the philosophical thesis of materialism. But the success of science does not actually entail the truth of materialism. In respect to declaring certain phenomena impossible because they don't cohere with a scientific worldview, it is important to remember that scientific knowledge is not complete. Science hasn't even established the fundamental nature of matter, much less that matter is all that there is. Likewise, how consciousness relates to matter is unknown, also known as the hard problem in contemporary philosophy. And finally, and most importantly, the impossible sometimes happens. Although there is, as I mentioned, some scientific evidence of the impossible, as Jeff Kripal has argued, and it tends to happen more robustly in the context of human life, in a moment of personal crisis, or a highly controlled and emotionally charged ritual setting, not in the context of a modern scientific laboratory. In sum, the fact that our current scientific theory can't explain these phenomena yet, maybe it will, does not mean that they don't happen, that they can't be studied, or that they are unimportant. Instead, it suggests that we need better theories and multiple methods of study. As Jeff has also argued quite a bit, we need the humanities. The humanities has a lot to offer in this regard, and I agree. In my view, the study of human history, religion, and culture not only provides copious evidence of the paranormal, but it can help us gain critical distance from our own social and cultural contexts and their default assumptions. It can introduce us to other ways of knowing and being, inclusive of the reality of the paranormal. It can introduce us to multiple ways of interpreting, classifying, and interpreting paranormal phenomena, probably without this concept of it paranormal versus normal. But, insight into contemplative and ritual technologies. It can introduce us to a variety of contemplative and ritual technologies to generate, shut down, or navigate paranormal events. Such study also unearths and helps generate theories to explain what is going on in these experiences. Here, I'm thinking of constructive work in the philosophy and history of religions, as well as exposure to theories already developed by cultures or subcultures in which the paranormal is normal. In other words, beyond providing data to compare and analyze, other cultures offer sophisticated frameworks for explaining and interpreting phenomena, experiences, or events that confound our own understanding. In this way, the comparative study of human history, religions, and cultures can also teach us some much-needed humility. So it's hard to look around our world today with its converging ecological, social, and psychological crises and not suspect that something is terribly broken, that there's something deeply wrong with an epistemology that views the natural world and other living beings and even other human beings as objects to dominate and control rather than others with whom we are in relation. In other words, I'd like to suggest that our assumptions about the world and how we know it are in trouble, not merely because they cannot explain how supposedly impossible things actually do happen, but because they are failing to promote human and planetary flourishing. More bluntly, they are driving us towards destruction. But what if this dualistic epistemology were not our only option? What if we had a theory of knowing based on a living embodied situation of relationality and interconnection? What if we conceived of knowledge not primarily as information about an object, but as transformation affected through relationship with other beings, both animate and inanimate? What if the world is not given, but continually coming into being through interaction with these other beings? As suggested by the subtitle of this slide, I'm inspired in this line of thinking by Jorge Ferrer's participatory theory and Hannah de Jager's inactive approach to inner subjectivity, as well as some Buddhist concepts of the relation between mind, action, and world, and interconnection. So I'm going to circle back around to this proposed epistemology in my conclusion, but for now, I'd just like to suggest that if this relational theory of knowledge sounds strange, it is only because we are used to the idea of objective knowledge as primary or foundational, rather than as an often useful and sometimes not useful and sometimes even violent abstraction from the multiply embedded and embodied contexts of human life. It only seems strange because of our cultural focus on waking rational and perceptual modes of consciousness, which privilege this abstracted objective knowledge. We exclude forms of knowing that operate through the body, heart, and intuition, or in so-called altered states of consciousness, such as dream, vision, non-dual awareness, or any number of meditative states. And as Charlie had mentioned yesterday, but it was already in my slides, as the anthropologist Charles Laughlin has put it, the singular or monophasic style of consciousness in modern Western societies is a bit of an outlier in the history of human cultures, most of which have developed ways of knowing and being and interacting with other kinds of beings based on more than one modality of consciousness. In other words, they have been polyphasic as opposed to monophasic. Many traditional cultures, including those from which Buddhism sprang and in which it has flourished, have been polyphasic. As another anthropologist, Tanya Luhrmann, has demonstrated, how we direct our attention changes our experience of the world. It changes our experience of what is real. This is also the basic principle, I think, underlying Buddhist contemplative practice. The fact that Buddhist cultures are traditionally polyphasic, that they understand experience, knowledge, and insight to be relative to one's level of mental cultivation, and tend to have more flexible boundaries between mind and matter, subject and object, and inner and outer, probably explains why Buddhism is chock full of the impossible. I'm going to take a little water break. So I had initially envisioned a slide that was just like overwhelmingly full of terms, but that was going to take a really long time to organize. So let us start with karma and rebirth. Okay, so karma and rebirth is built into the Buddha's diagnosis of human suffering, as well as classical formulations of dependent arising or origination and right view, the foundation of the Buddhist path to awakening or liberation from suffering. Karma and rebirth are not impossible or even unnatural from a Buddhist perspective. The idea that one is reborn according to one's actions is simply based on the understanding that mind or consciousness rather than matter is primary. Some Buddhist traditions understand matter as a basic constituent of a dualistic reality that includes mind, where others incline towards idealism, non-dual monism, or anti-foundationalism or anti-realism. But none reduce mind to matter or deny that when it comes to suffering and its ending, it's mind that matters. So Buddhist contemplative theory and practice builds on this idea, detailing an array of mind over matter or mind beyond matter psychic powers cultivated through meditative concentration or samadhi. These include skills like clairaudience, clairvoyance, mind reading, recollection of past lives, the generation of an astral or mind-made body, astral travel to other worlds, bilocation, levitation, flying, walking on water, walking through walls, and various forms of interaction with non-human beings. This is just a sampling of what we find in the Pali Suttas in the Theravada tradition. In the visionary traditions of Mahayana Buddhism and the alchemical teachings of Vajrayana Buddhism, we find even more dramatic displays of psychic and magical powers. So it's reasonable to assume that there's some creative license and embroidery going on in the literary and oral descriptions of these powers, but it's presumptive to imagine that there's no experiential basis for any of it, especially when we consider that the view that experiences in altered meditative states or visionary states are real, if not more real, than those that occur in ordinary waking states. From a Buddhist perspective, our ordinary waking states are deluded. They are what we need to wake up from, which brings me to my next point. Awakening itself can be considered a kind of paranormal event or transformation under almost any traditional definition. Whether it's defined as complete transcendence of the cycle of suffering and rebirth, liberating insight into the insubstantiality of all phenomena, or the realization of a primordial awareness beyond all space and time, awakening is not particularly amenable to scientific analysis or materialist description. And to this list, I've added a small sampling of the paranormal in Tibetan Buddhism, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip it for now. Some of these topics will come up later. So serious scholars don't deny that these phenomena are reported in Buddhist traditions. But they treat them as cultural, historical, or literary artifacts, as things that concern other people's experience, or other people's beliefs, or other people's imaginations, rather than as things that might sometimes happen and might have profound implications for our own understanding of the world. As a result, the potential reality of these phenomena is a matter of personal speculation and largely irrelevant to the professional study of Buddhism. Indeed, to speak too directly of their possibility is to risk one's reputation as a serious scholar. So this brings us to how the impossible is quarantined in Buddhist studies. I already mentioned one way that the impossible is quarantined in Buddhist studies. One of the ways that it is kept from infecting our departments and minds with doubts about what is real and how we know it. This is treating the paranormal, and as I described before, as a cultural, historical, or literary artifact specific to other people's experiences and beliefs and so on. And so we can call this contextualization or over-contextualization. And this is reinforced by a lack of emphasis on comparative and interdisciplinary study. For example, the textual scholar or the historian whose research includes an account of a fabulous visionary journey is not expected to look at similar phenomena in other literary or historical traditions. They're not expected to look at ethnographic counts of such journeys in the living tradition, much less at phenomenologically similar forms of journeying in other living cultures, including one's home culture, such as out-of-body experiences or UFO experiences. They are also not expected to consider parapsychological research of related phenomena. Without such comparative and interdisciplinary work, the journey in question can remain safely as an oddity of a particular religious or cultural imagination and is unlikely to make us question the nature, reality, or value of such visionary experiences or our own ordinary, boring waking experiences. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that context is unimportant. Context may be a large part of what the phenomenon is, how or why it happens. And we saw this, I think, in Stephen Finley's talk on UFO experiences in the Nation of Islam. But the fact that there are similar experiences elsewhere suggests that we also can't reduce it merely to context, right? There's something more going on. So over-contextualization and lack of emphasis on comparative and interdisciplinary study are related to another strategy for keeping the paranormal at bay, and this is ontological bracketing. So the term is most familiar in anthropology. It's the methodological practice of refraining from commenting on the reality of paranormal phenomena. It's the methodological practice of refraining from comment on other people's worlds. But ontological bracketing tends to do this anyway, right? So it's a good ethical practice not to come, judge somebody else's world. But by not talking about it at all, not entertaining it at all, the result is reinforcing the implicit ontological framework of the researcher in their audience. For example, the anthropologist does not bracket chickens or tables. They only bracket river spirits and magical boundaries. Other options would be to engage in a more dialogical approach, tacking between different ontological frameworks, or to engage in what the para-anthropologist Jack Hunter calls ontological flooding. That is, allowing multiple ontological frameworks to remain on the table in an open-ended inquiry and exploration. But ontological bracketing is not only found in anthropology, it's also the norm in historical and textual study. Here it synergizes with over-specialization. So the scholar is off the hook, right? Because they're not philosophers. They don't have to, it's not their job to do ontology. Maybe that's fair. But even scholars who study Buddhist philosophy, whose job it is to engage in fundamental questions, also engage in ontological bracketing, leaving the damn topics aside as irrelevant to the primary business of doing philosophy today. They don't deny that these ideas are found in Buddhist traditions or that they are important to Buddhist thought and practice, but they are rarely thematized in comparative or constructive philosophical work. The task of thinking through contemporary, the task of thinking through contemporary philosophical problems with Buddhist ideas, which happens a lot in the study of Buddhist philosophy, but not with the damn topics. Or if the damn topics are included, it's by way of comparison to a naturalistic analog. There are, of course, practical reasons for not engaging with the damn topics. It's hard enough to get philosophy departments and journals to take any non-Western contribution seriously, even without all the woo. The tendency towards naturalism in comparative and constructive work in Buddhist philosophy is no doubt due in part to the fact that the primary conversation partners for Buddhist philosophy are often usually cognitive and neuroscientists, not anthropologists, parapsychologists, historians of religion, or UFO experiencers. So this is merely the latest development of the modernist idea that Buddhism is quite unlike other religions in being uniquely compatible with science, a dynamic which Evan Thompson has rightly criticized as Buddhist exceptionalism. So there's much to say on the topic of Buddhist exceptionalism and how it synergizes with all these other practices to exclude the damn topics. But the main takeaway for us, I lost my point, is that when you strip all the impossible, when you bracket all the impossible out of Buddhism, it does look pretty compatible with scientific naturalism. Who would have guessed? So this brings me to my final point about quarantining the impossible in Buddhist studies. And so I think Buddhism is somewhat a victim of its own success. So I suspect the popularity, the cultural popularity of secular forms of Buddhism, and especially Buddhist meditation, mindfulness, and so on, which are very much informed by by the idea of Buddhist exceptionalism, that this unduly pressures scholars and researchers to downplay elements of Buddhism that challenge naturalism. Okay, so what would it look like if things were different? If philosophers, historians, and textualists talked to each other, as well as to anthropologists, parapsychologists, and neuroscientists? No reason to kick them out. What would it look like if we were wildly comparative and interdisciplinary? What if instead of saying, it's not my job, we found a colleague whose job it was and collaborated with them? So I have this list of damn topics on here, and okay, I think I'm doing okay on time, right? It's 12:30 that we're at. Okay, good. I'll slow down my talking a little bit. Okay. So the book, I haven't gotten to the next slide yet. Okay, so in terms of these damn topics, I was overly ambitious. I'm not going to be able to treat all of these, especially psi or psychic powers. As you saw, the topic is vast, but I will touch upon it in my conclusion. But I will talk about these other topics here. So, rebirth. The books on the slide are meant to be suggestive of what could be included in a comparative and interdisciplinary study of rebirth. First, there's a great diversity of views on rebirth, even within Buddhist traditions. And it's important to look at these alongside traditional Buddhist arguments and theories, in order to help triangulate the phenomenon, or really phenomena plural, in question. And fortunately, Roger Jackson, whose book is pictured here on the right, provides an excellent overview of both of these tasks, both of these topics, in his recent book. Or that book provides, said that all funny. That book provides a good overview of these first two bullet points. Jackson, and another desideratum would be to compare these Buddhist ideas also with non-Buddhist ideas of rebirth. And so Jackson touches upon this in the book, but the most comprehensive study, which I didn't put on the slide, is Gananath Obisekere's Imagining Karma from like early 2000s. So another topic to consider is the parapsychological research on the phenomena of children who remember previous lives, begun under the auspices of Ian Stevenson and continued by Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia. Bhikkhu Analio's book, here in the middle, from 2018, is the most thorough attempt to consider rebirth in relation to this research, as well as that on near-death experiences and xenoglossy, that is, the knowledge of a language without present life study. Although this parapsychological research does not tell us how these phenomena happen, it is difficult to come away from it with the conviction that they don't happen or that they have conventional explanations. In the case of past life memories, for example, the fact that there are children who seem to remember living another life and can offer veridical information about that life does not prove that rebirth happens, much less that it always happens or that it happens because of karma, as Buddhists claim. It does, however, suggest a transmission of information that is not explicable according to current scientific theory. And rebirth, or the continuation of a consciousness beyond physical death, is a reasonable idea about how that might happen. Although most Buddhist studies scholars know of the UVA research, few engage with it. When it is mentioned, as in Christopher Gowan's Philosophy of the Buddha, or Evan Thompson's Waking, Dreaming, and Being, it tends to be dismissed as inconclusive or methodologically flawed without any detailed discussion of the findings or of the ways that the methods have improved over the years in response to the critics. The strongest cases are not presented as reasons to entertain the Buddhist view or to tout, or at least to doubt, the idea that consciousness depends on a brain or body. Usually, however, in both academic and popular books on Buddhism, the question of rebirth and other doctrines that do not cohere with modern naturalism are simply ignored or again bracketed. Or it is suggested that these doctrines are just so much Indian cultural baggage, which ought to be jettisoned entirely or unpacked and repacked in light of current scientific knowledge. Never mind how one's own baggage might inform this view. And the last point here on the slide is that philosophical engagement with the question of rebirth should really take into account the whole diversity, both in Buddhist cultures and outside of Buddhist cultures, of experiences related to death. And so afterlife apparitions, mediumship, all kinds of other phenomena. So this brings me to my final smattering of damn topics. And again, I was a little overly ambitious, and actually I'm just going to get these points up here. Oops, oh, no. Okay, good. Slide. Because I'm going to skip around a little bit. So with the headings of biophysical and experiential, I had intended to elaborate on a point that others have already made, that we cannot neglect either biophysical or experiential dimensions of paranormal phenomena. And to this end, I was going to note the phenomena of Tukdam, when a highly accomplished meditator's body does not decay after death for days or even weeks, and there's a recent film you can see about this. And like incorruptible saints in Catholicism, the body does not smell or smells like flowers. So that's a damn topic if I ever smelled one. However, the topic that I'm going to say a little bit more about is visionary journeys to other realms, including post-mortem realms. So among the books on the screen, you'll see a picture of my colleague, Alison Prude. Alison is at Georgia Southern University, and she studies the Tibetan and Himalayan phenomena of delogs. Delogs are people, usually socially marginalized, often women, who die and return from the realms of the dead or the realm in between lives called the bardo. Like near-death experiences, they return with messages for the living. Some of these include veridical information that is difficult to explain by conventional means. And like near-death experiences, there is a biophysical component, but in the case of delogs, it's supposed to be days, not minutes or hours. And like many UFO experiencers, the initial journey and subsequent return trips are spontaneous and unintentional. Delogs may be pious, but rarely have formal religious education or meditative practice. They traverse some of the same post-mortem territory as lamas who journey by way of dream yoga or meditation, but they generally do not report on some of the more subtle aspects of the moment of death or the bardo, where Tibetan tradition holds that there are opportunities to awaken. They focus more on culturally relevant issues, such as karma and its effects. There's a lot to study here in terms of similarities and differences between all of these phenomena I've mentioned, not to mention comparisons to shamanic initiation and journeying. But the question I'd like to focus on is this: what to make of the cultural specificity of these phenomena? Scholars who analyze near-death experiences cross-culturally argue that we should hold open the possibility that these experiences are not merely psychological, but social or intersubjective. This tracks with what many Western out-of-body journeyers like Bob Monroe, but there's many others, what they report. If you're not familiar with this literature, it's fascinating. It's full of practical instructions on how to get out of body, as well as fascinating descriptions of intersubjective, heavenly, hellish, and just plain other realms. So it's fun to read this stuff, but how can we make sense of it? In the study of religious or mystical experience, there's an important debate over what to make of mystical experiences. Are they simply private imaginings constructed from the individual's personal psychology and culture, or do they provide a glimpse of some transcultural, transpersonal reality, which only takes on cultural specificity in the telling or the interpretation of the experience? Or is there some other option? One that preserves the idea that these experiences are influenced by individual psychology and culture, and the idea that they are real and might be intersubjective. So clearly the imagination is at work, especially in these visionary journeys. And I can't, so we need to account for how it's working here. And I can't do justice to it here. And again, I will mention, many of you might be familiar with Jeff's writing on the imagination as the sixth super sense, as the medium in which some transcendent reality comes through, often spontaneously, in a flash. And that certainly happens in Buddhist contexts. Maybe we can even consider delogs as a kind of example of this. However, as I mentioned before, I think Tanya Luhrmann's theories about the careful and consistent cultivation of the imagination are also helpful. Indeed, I suspect that both the spontaneous and cultured dimensions of the imagination are at work not just in our wild visionary journeys, but in our everyday experience. Okay. And in regard to truly extraordinary powers of the imagination, however, I also find Jess Hollenbeck, who I was introduced to by Jeff, quite helpful. In his comparative study of visionary mystical traditions, Hollenbeck discusses how various recollective practices or practices that focus on attention empower the imagination such that a person may not only experience insights into a deeper order of reality, but may also acquire psychic powers, including the locomotive power to travel non-physically within this world and to other worlds, and the power to materialize things imagined, such as landscapes or objects, such that they appear external to the imaginer themselves as well as to other people. Given the intersubjective nature of information and phenomena that emerged from an empower imagination, Hollenbeck argues that although its creations are clearly shaped by culture, they are not just thereby just culture. In other words, not everything imagined is imaginary. And to this list of powers enjoyed by the imagination, Buddhist traditions might add the power, or would add, the power to create or co-create worlds, from the various samsaric worlds of rebirth to Buddha realms or Pure Lands. And so I'm going to address these last couple points, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different order. So I sometimes think of while Hollenbeck's project is primarily descriptive, Jorge Ferrer offers an ontological and epistemological framework for thinking about these experiences. It also addresses these last three bullet points that I just put up, but again, I'll treat them in a slightly different order. So I sometimes think of Ferrer's participatory theory is the greatest theory that no one in Buddhist studies has ever heard of. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's not much. So I'm going to say a little bit about participatory theory. So I mentioned this theory earlier. It aims to account for the role of culture and context, as well as the novelty, strangeness, and transformative power of extraordinary experiences without reducing them to the subjective experience of the individual, or assuming a pre-given objective state of affairs. It also deals directly with the problem of pluralism. That is, how can religious experiences yield knowledge if every religion makes a different claim? We can easily expand this to include transpersonal experiences that happen outside of any religious context. So participatory theory builds on the cognitive science idea of inaction. And inaction is the idea that the world of an organism experiences is not out there, but something that is created or enacted through the organism's interaction with its environment, and this world is relative to the kind of organism it is. In other words, the worlds of a bat, tardigrade, pictured here, and human are radically different. None is the way things are, but all are real. In the theory of participation expands on this, but instead of a given physical environment, it speaks of an undetermined mystery or the creative energy of life. And instead of biological organisms, it speaks of beings who may or may not have physical bodies, and they may also have minds, hearts, and intuition. Beings participate with each other and with the mystery to bring their worlds into beings. And so no participatory co-creation is the way things are, but all are real. However, all are not necessarily equal. Some worlds promote greater well-being than others. The core metaphors for this are, instead of the familiar, you might be familiar with this idea of the many paths go up to the one mountain. So instead of that, the idea is that the path is made by walking. One can follow trails that were forged by others or forge their own trails. Instead of many rivers running into the same ocean, there is one great ocean with many shores. This is all to say that different spiritual cultures, even different individuals, may be going different places. They may be discovering different realities or bringing into being different realities, and even completely different transpersonal or transcendent realities. And so this on the participatory view, as mentioned earlier, this part wasn't mentioned earlier, but spiritual experiences, and indeed all experiences, are not experiences of something, of an object, or of a world. They are events. That is, in terms of structure, it's not a subject experiencing an object, but an event, like a party, right? So it's neither exclusively objective or subjective. It involves internal and external conditions. It cannot be forced, although one can make preparations for it, and it can be spontaneous. In terms of location, it can be multi-local. It can occur in an individual, in a relationship, in a community, in a collective consciousness, and in a place. And it could be in some or all of these locations. And finally, an event is participatory in the sense that it is not objective, it is not neutral, it is not merely cognitive. It involves multiple dimensions of the human being: our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our intuition, and also participation perhaps of other kinds of beings as well. And there's no bullet point for this, but different states of consciousness can also alter how we participate, right? How we participate in these different things are very much affected by our state of consciousness. So to sum up, participatory theory takes account of the fact that spiritual worlds, and worlds in general, I'll add, are radically different across cultures, but says that this does not mean that they are only in the mind. For those of us who are worried about anthropocentrism, other than human beings and even places can be participants in co-created events. On the participatory view, knowledge is not knowledge of some independent or ultimate state of affairs, but the transformation that takes place as the result of a participatory event. I didn't elaborate on this point today, but participatory theory also takes account of the intentional and unintentional, as well as the constructive and deconstructive processes of the imagination. It also accounts for how the ordinary boundaries of subjective versus objective, mind versus matter, inner versus outer, are often breached or entangled in anomalous experience. Similar to Jeff Hollenbeck's theories, participatory theory also offers a way to explain how all that is imagined, similar to Jeff and Hollenbeck's theories, participatory theory also offers a way to explain how all that is imagined might not be imaginary. But it focuses more on the process of becoming rather than on something outside coming through. So bringing it all back to Buddhism in the possible. Okay, what does this have to do with Buddhism? After all, I suggest that Buddhists have their own sophisticated theories for accounting for the impossible, formal philosophical theories as well as practical theories embedded in their contemplative and ritual technologies. So why did I plug participatory theory? As I alluded to earlier, I think there are important resonances between participatory theory and a lot of different Buddhist theories. So I think that Yogacara theories about the co-creation of worlds through mind and action has a lot of resonances, as does the idea in certain Tibetan teachings on the world as the spontaneous display or play of a non-dual awareness. Also, we could add here the Huayan Chinese Buddhist ideas of interpenetration or interconnection of all beings or phenomena. And to this, I would add another bullet point, again, the implicit or explicit logic embedded in a lot of ritual and contemplative practice, I think, relates. And I see Joel nodding, so maybe you're going to talk about something like that this afternoon. So, however, classical Buddhist traditions generally do not tolerate cultural or spiritual pluralism as well as the participatory framework does, in my view. They tend to be fairly settled on a Buddhist cosmological framework, at least at a provisional level of reality, and they also tend to be assured of the universal superiority of their own view of the path and the goal of awakening to the way things are. So, but I'm not totally decided on this last point, so I wanted to end on this thought. I'm not totally decided that there isn't room, especially for constructive work within classical Buddhist theories, for a more happily comparative framework. And I didn't even touch on anti-realism or anti-foundationalism of Madhyamaka, which might be one place to start as well. So I invite my colleagues in Buddhist philosophy to think in wildly comparative and interdisciplinary ways about the damned topics, and then get back to me with their thoughts.